August 19th, 1944. Northern France. Morning mist hung low over the countryside. Long, narrow roads cut through golden wheat fields and small stone villages. The air was still. No artillery, no aircraft, no movement. Then, in the distance, engines. American armored columns began to appear along the empty roads. Sherman tanks rolled forward in long, disciplined lines. Half-tracks followed behind, carrying infantry who watched the quiet fields carefully. Dust rose slowly into the morning light. There was no resistance, no German roadblocks, no artillery fire, no defensive lines. Just open roads stretching deeper into France. Inside his command vehicle, George S. Patton studied the map. The situation was unusual. Most commanders slowed down when advancing into uncertain territory, but Patton saw something else: opportunity. German forces were retreating. Their defenses were disorganized. Towns and cities could become traps, narrow streets, ambush points, destroyed bridges. But the open countryside offered speed, and speed to Patton was more powerful than caution. Orders were issued. The columns did not stop. They accelerated. Within hours, American forces were advancing faster than anyone had expected. Roads once quiet now carried thousands of vehicles pushing east. It was a decision that would reshape the Allied advance across France. And it began with something deceptively simple: empty roads, stretching toward a collapsing enemy. Because before this moment, the war in France had looked very different, and the road to this sudden breakthrough began weeks earlier on the beaches of Normandy. June 6, 1944. The Allied invasion of Western Europe began with the Normandy landings. Along the beaches of northern France, American, British, and Canadian forces pushed ashore under heavy German fire. The landings were costly, uncertain, and slow. In the first weeks after D-Day, progress inland was limited. German forces, particularly under Erwin Rommel, had prepared strong defensive positions. Thick hedgerows, known as the bocage, divided the countryside into natural fortresses. Each field became a defensive strongpoint. Tanks struggled to maneuver. Infantry moved cautiously, often advancing only a few hundred meters at a time. The war in France became slow, grinding, and exhausting. American forces under Omar Bradley pushed gradually southward. Casualties mounted. Progress remained limited. German resistance, though weakened by Allied air superiority, continued to hold critical ground. For weeks, the front barely moved. Then, in late July 1944, the Allies launched Operation Cobra. Massive aerial bombardments struck German defensive lines near Saint-Lô. Thousands of bombs fell in concentrated waves. The ground shook. German communications collapsed. Defensive cohesion weakened. When American ground forces advanced, the German front began to crack. This was the moment Allied commanders had been waiting for. Once the defensive lines broke, maneuver warfare returned. Tanks moved into open countryside. Infantry followed quickly. German units, already weakened and stretched thin, began to retreat. Into this rapidly changing situation stepped George S. Patton. On August 1, 1944, Patton officially took command of the U.S. Third Army. For months, Patton had waited. His army had been assembled quietly in England, prepared for rapid movement once the breakout began. Now, the opportunity had arrived. Patton's Third Army moved quickly through the newly opened front. German units, already withdrawing, found themselves under increasing pressure. The pace of the battlefield changed dramatically.
But speed created new problems. Allied supply lines stretched across the beaches of Normandy. Fuel, ammunition, and food moved slowly along crowded roads. Thousands of vehicles competed for limited routes. Commanders began to worry about overextension. Most commanders advanced cautiously, but Patton had always believed that speed itself could become a weapon. And as German resistance weakened, he began to notice something unusual. The roads ahead were becoming increasingly open, increasingly empty, and increasingly dangerous, or increasingly valuable. The decision forming in Patton's mind would soon challenge conventional caution and reshape how the Third Army advanced across France. By early August 1944, the battlefield in France had transformed. German formations were no longer holding fixed defensive lines. Instead, they were retreating, often quickly, sometimes chaotically. Roads that had once been guarded were now partially abandoned. Towns that had been expected to resist were left with only scattered defenders. But advancing through France still carried serious risks. Much of the country consisted of old towns and medieval villages. Narrow streets twisted between stone buildings. Bridges crossed rivers at limited points. In many locations, only a single road connected one town to the next. These urban choke points created natural ambush zones. German forces, even while retreating, could still defend towns effectively. A handful of anti-tank guns positioned in narrow streets could stop an armored column. Demolished bridges forced long detours. Mines and roadblocks slowed movement further. This had already been seen in earlier fighting across Normandy. Urban combat drained time and resources. Tanks became vulnerable. Infantry suffered higher casualties. Commanders often preferred to surround towns rather than attack directly, but that required time. Time in August 1944 was becoming increasingly valuable. Meanwhile, the open countryside offered something very different. France's rural regions contained wide farm roads, open fields, and long stretches of terrain suitable for armored movement. These roads bypassed heavily built-up areas. They reduced the risk of ambush. Most importantly, they allowed continuous forward movement. This type of maneuver warfare suited George S. Patton perfectly. Patton had long believed in mobility. He studied earlier campaigns, including those of George S. Patton himself in North Africa and German fast-moving operations earlier in the war. Rapid movement, he believed, created confusion. Confusion weakened resistance, and weakened resistance led to collapse. By mid-August, reports arriving at Third Army headquarters showed German units withdrawing faster than expected. Reconnaissance vehicles encountered minimal resistance. Some French towns were liberated without major fighting. The pattern was becoming clear. Where Allied forces slowed to secure towns, progress became cautious. Where they used open roads, advances accelerated dramatically. But choosing open roads came with risks. Flanks became exposed, supply lines stretched thin. German counterattacks could isolate forward units. Many commanders preferred methodical advances, securing each area before moving forward. Patton saw the situation differently. He believed that German forces were already disorganized and that hesitation would give them time to regroup. Speed, in his view, was not reckless, it was decisive. Soon, orders began to reflect this thinking. Armored columns were directed to bypass strong points. Towns were sometimes left behind temporarily. Units moved deeper into open countryside, following roads that seemed almost too quiet. The Third Army began advancing faster than expected, and what started as a tactical adjustment soon became a defining strategy, because once Patton committed to open road maneuver warfare, the advance across France began to accelerate, and the consequences would soon be felt across the entire Western Front.
The roads ahead of the U.S. Third Army were no longer contested in the traditional sense. German resistance existed, but it appeared scattered, disorganized, and constantly retreating. This was exactly the type of battlefield George S. Patton had been waiting for. Once the breakout from Normandy gained momentum, Patton pushed his armored divisions forward with increasing urgency. Units from the 4th Armored Division, 6th Armored Division, and 5th Infantry Division began advancing along open countryside routes. The speed surprised even Allied planners. Columns moved day and night. Tanks rolled through villages where German troops had withdrawn only hours earlier. French civilians watched in disbelief as American vehicles passed continuously, pushing east without stopping. In some areas, Third Army units advanced over 40 miles in a single day, a remarkable pace for World War II ground operations. The open road strategy began to show its full effect. German command struggled to understand where the main Allied thrust was forming. Reports arriving at German headquarters were inconsistent. Some units reported American forces far behind expected positions. Others warned that American tanks had already passed through their sectors. This confusion spread quickly. German formations withdrawing from Normandy found themselves overtaken by fast-moving American columns. Roads became crowded with retreating German vehicles, abandoned equipment, and disrupted supply lines. Patton's forces exploited this chaos. Instead of pausing to secure every town, armored spearheads bypassed resistance whenever possible. Infantry units followed later to secure liberated areas. The front line became fluid, shifting constantly as American forces pushed deeper. By mid-August, the advance had accelerated dramatically. Cities such as Le Mans fell quickly. German forces attempted to reorganize, but Patton's rapid movement prevented them from establishing defensive lines. The battlefield became a race, and the Third Army was moving faster than anyone expected. Even Allied commanders began to take notice. Reports described Patton's forces advancing at a pace rarely seen in European combat. Open roads allowed continuous movement. German resistance weakened further as units struggled to keep pace with the fast-moving front. But speed created its own danger. Fuel consumption increased dramatically. Supply lines stretched further across France. Trucks struggled to keep pace with advancing armored columns. Patton's army was now moving so fast it risked outrunning its own logistics. And this growing problem would soon force one of the most dangerous decisions of the entire advance. By late August 1944, the speed of the U.S. Third Army had become both its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. Armored divisions were advancing rapidly across France. Columns stretched across hundreds of kilometers. Tanks, half-tracks, artillery, and supply vehicles moved almost continuously. But every mile consumed fuel. The faster Patton advanced, the more fuel his army required. And fuel in August 1944 was becoming one of the most critical resources on the Western Front. Allied supply lines still depended heavily on the beaches of Normandy. Fuel had to be transported by truck across crowded and damaged roads. The rapid advance meant that supply depots remained far behind the front. Soon, reports began arriving at Third Army headquarters. Some armored units were running dangerously low on fuel. Others were forced to slow their advance. A few units even stopped temporarily, waiting for supply convoys. This created a serious operational risk. If German forces reorganized and counterattacked, isolated American units could be vulnerable. Fast-moving spearheads depended on continuous support. Without fuel, tanks became stationary targets. Most commanders would have slowed the advance, but George S. Patton believed that momentum itself was the key to victory. German forces were already retreating. Their command structure was strained. If the Third Army paused, the Germans might regroup, establish defensive lines, and slow the Allied advance. Patton chose to keep moving. he prioritized fuel for forward units. Supply trucks were redirected toward armored spearheads. Some units received just enough fuel to continue advancing. Others operated under strict conservation measures. Meanwhile, Patton continued pushing east. American forces moved toward the Seine River region and deeper into central France. German units attempted to withdraw, but fast-moving American columns intercepted retreat routes. The speed of the advance created growing confusion among German commanders. Some formations found themselves cut off. Others abandoned heavy equipment to retreat faster. The battlefield became increasingly fluid, but the risk remained real. Fuel shortages slowed certain units. Supply convoys struggled to keep pace. Allied high command began to consider how to allocate limited fuel between advancing armies. This led to growing tension between Allied commanders, including Dwight Eisenhower and Bernard Montgomery, who were also directing operations across Northern Europe. Fuel became not just a logistical issue, but a strategic decision. Who would receive priority? Which army would push forward? Where would the main Allied effort focus? Patton's open road strategy helped create an unexpected situation, an army advancing so quickly that supply lines struggled to keep up. Yet, despite these challenges, the Third Army had already achieved something remarkable. German defenses across large parts of France had collapsed. American forces were advancing faster than anticipated, and Patton's gamble on speed reshaped the battlefield. But the consequences of this rapid advance were only beginning to unfold. Because once the Germans stabilized their lines near the borders of Germany, the fast-moving war across open roads would transform into something far more difficult. Patton's open road strategy helped accelerate the collapse of German forces across France. The U.S. Third Army advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks, liberating vast territories. German units already retreating struggled to reorganize against the rapid movement. Cities that might have become strong defensive points were bypassed or quickly surrounded. However, the speed created fuel shortages, forcing Allied command to slow the advance near Germany. Still, the breakthrough reshaped the Western Front and pushed German forces towards their borders. Patton's gamble proved that in modern warfare, speed and open roads could become decisive weapons. The advance across France in the summer of 1944 revealed something simple yet powerful. George S. Patton did not rely only on firepower, he relied on movement. While many commanders focused on securing every town, Patton looked beyond them, toward the open roads stretching ahead. Those roads offered speed. Speed created confusion, and confusion weakened an already retreating enemy. The U.S. Third Army moved faster than expected, not because resistance disappeared, but because Patton chose momentum over caution. His forces bypassed obstacles, avoided unnecessary delays, and kept pressure on German formations that were already struggling to reorganize. The result was one of the fastest advances of World War II. Within weeks, large portions of France were liberated. German defenses collapsed across wide areas, and the Western Front shifted rapidly towards Germany's borders. Yet the strategy also revealed a lasting lesson. Speed could win ground, but logistics still controlled the limits of warfare. Fuel shortages eventually slowed the advance. Open roads could carry an army forward, but supplies had to follow. Even so, Patton's open road strategy left a lasting impression on modern military thinking. Maneuver warfare, rapid advances, and exploiting enemy confusion became key principles studied long after the war ended. Because in August 1944, victory did not come from a single battle. It came from movement, from quiet countryside roads, and from a commander who saw opportunity where others saw uncertainty.